All right, here we go. So thank you, Swamiji, for being here with me
Sure.
today. I'm really excited. We just talked for a minute about uh, you know, what the Ramakrishna and Vedanta stuff means to me. I could say stuff. I should, I'm not as articulate as some of the stuff I've seen you say. Do you, you know what? Can we just really quickly? I know I should be more professional, but let's really quickly. You're intimidatingly smart to me. So I feel
Kind of
within
is.
the Ramakrishna lineage and the intellect, I'm a little nervous today, but I'm excited still. So thank you for
Oh
being
no,
here.
don't be nervous. Yeah, no, don't worry about it. But thank you.
Yeah. So I think maybe what we'll do quickly first, even though I will do a separate intro to this, is introduce yourself in whatever way you feel most isn't important for people to hear, because my podcast isn't strictly in the Vedanta realm.
Mhm.
So just yourself, and then maybe a follow-up would be just to kind of, for someone, because I've already mentioned Ramakrishna and I have in other podcasts, but I would love for you to give us like a quick introduction to someone who has no idea who we're talking about, and just kind of a snapshot. So if you could do that, I would really love to hear that.
Okay, so regarding the first thing, I can mention a little bit of kind of autobiographical information, basically, which is my name is Swami Medhananda. I was born and raised in Lexington, Massachusetts, or let's say born and raised in Boston,
Hmm.
and grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts. Um, and then I studied at Berkeley in California. I studied philosophy and English literature, especially modernist American poetry. Um,
Hmm.
and it was mostly Western philosophy. And I decided to do my PhD, and I studied at Oxford as well, continuing studies in philosophy and literature. And then I came back to Berkeley for my PhD, where I specialized in German philosophy, Kant and Hegel and others. And that ended up, my dissertation became my first published book called The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno,
Hmm.
10 years ago. Um, and after getting the PhD, well, no, before that, actually, I should say, um, I have to rewind a little bit. So growing up in Boston, I grew up, I'm Bengali, ethnically Bengali. I grew up in a Bengali family. And so my parents would take me to uh, cultural and religious events once in a while throughout the year, especially Durga Puja, worship of goddess Durga, Saraswati Puja as well, worship of Saraswati, Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, and so on and so forth. And I would come away feeling somehow profoundly uninspired by all this.
Hmm.
Um, and it all just kind of turned me off because nobody explained to me the deeper spiritual significance of these rituals and what exactly I was worshiping. Who is that? Why are there all these images? And it all seemed very kind of superstitious and meaningless to me. And as a result, I became agnostic,
Hmm.
a good philosopher. And it was only at about the age of 19 when I read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time carefully in translation, in English translation for the first time,
Hmm.
um, that I recognized that there are profound spiritual depths to Hinduism, which I had no idea about because nobody had explained it to me growing up. Um, and the things that really gripped me in the Bhagavad Gita were I was still an agnostic actually. So even as an agnostic, I was kind of still deeply gripped by the Bhagavad Gita, but the non bhakti aspects, the non devotional aspects of the text. So, for
Hmm.
instance, the emphasis on renunciation, the need to renounce worldly pleasures and attachments in order to achieve a more transcendental peace and fulfillment. That really resonated with me. But another thing that really resonated with me is the Vedantic teaching that we are not the body, we're also not the mind, but we're something different. We're an eternal self separate from the body mind complex. And that from a young age really gripped me. Um, And so actually, really, more or less after that, um, I had kind of inchoately decided. I mean, it wasn't fully conscious in my mind at that point, but I'd inchoately decided that I would be a monk.
Hmm.
Um, I just like knew that I knew I wouldn't marry, and I knew that the monastic path would be the right path for me. And within a couple of years, that inchoate kind of conviction really uh, coalesced into a conscious decision. It was within, I remember, within one semester of grad school when I was at Berkeley. And I was very academically motivated. And so when I told my friends and even my professors, I said, I'm going to finish my PhD and then move to India and become a sannyasi. And they just wouldn't believe me.
Right.
They're like, you're an academic's academic, and there's no way. And but I did it. And but again, I should rewind a little bit. So at this point, I was still agnostic. I was an agnostic who was convinced that he would become a monk in India. And I hadn't read a word of the life or teachings of my particular tradition, which I belong to now, which is the Ramakrishna tradition. And so it was during my PhD that I read Swami Vivekananda's, I think the first book I read was Raja Yoga. And I really loved it. And I also read Swami Nikhilanandaji's biography of Swami Vivekananda, which is incredible. So I read these things and I was so inspired that I ordered the whole 9 volume complete works of Swami Vivekananda from India, and they shipped them here to California. And I remember that the cost of shipping was more than the cost of the books themselves, because books in
Right.
India are cheap. But and I just devoured all 9 volumes while I was doing the PhD. And then a lot of my ideas about spiritual life became a lot clearer. And I knew that I would be a monk in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. And one of the things that really appealed to me was the harmony of religions that our tradition teaches. Because another thing that was really kind of sticking in my craw when I was a kind of searching agnostic, but you can also call me a spiritual seeker, was I was reading the different world's religious scriptures. I was reading the Bible, reading parts of the Quran, reading Dhammapada from Buddhism, reading the Gita. And I found that at certain points, these scriptures seem to conflict with each other. And at the same time, that they're making these huge claims, which, if they're true, then they're extraordinarily important, more
Hmm.
important than anything else. And then, but the other thing that puzzled me as a kind of a rational thinker was, well, just because I was born into Hinduism or born into a Hindu family doesn't mean that I should accept Hinduism over the other faiths. That's not rational.
Hmm.
And so I was really struggling with these questions. If one religion is true, do the others have to be false? Or is it possible in some way that there's a deeper unity? And so it was when I first read the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda that I began to understand how different religions can be different paths to the same goal. So that actually seems like as good a segue as any to summarizing
Right.
briefly what's so significant about the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. Is that the second question that you'd like me to answer?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. You definitely already started
Yeah.
sneaking into it. So
Okay.
I think this is a perfect segue. And just to throw in a mirror, a very different, a simpler mirrored version of your experience is that just because I think it's so important, the harmony of religions. I think it's such a, I'm glad you mentioned it because I remember my dad's Jewish, my mom's Catholic, and I remember at some point I became atheist. I was like,
Yep.
well, you guys are both wrong. Someone's wrong. So I
They
guess
cancel each other out. Yeah.
right. So I was like, I can't believe either. And
Mm,
then it's interesting enough when I started reading some of these things and ended up at the Vedanta Society that I go to, I was like, wait, maybe they're both right instead of both wrong.
exactly.
And
Absolutely.
that's, so I love hearing you share the similar trajectory. But yeah, like you said, perfect segue to talk about where Ramakrishna comes in terms of introduction.
Sure. And then I guess I mean, maybe I can also complete later after that, circle back to post PhD and moving to India and being a monk
Mhm.
and all that stuff, because we
Okay.
haven't gotten there yet. But yeah,
Right.
just remind me if I forget. So yeah, Sri Ramakrishna. He was a real spiritual phenomenon, we can say. Born in 1836, passed away, or as we like to say as Hindus, left his body in 1886. Why do we say left his body? Because he's not the body, he's actually the eternal spirit. And it's the spirit leaving the ephemeral body. That's the more accurate way of putting it, according to Vedanta. Um, so Ramakrishna was unique in many ways, but one of the things that really distinguishes him from even other great saints and mystics is that after having attained spiritual realization of God for the first time, he wasn't satisfied. It was an incredible, overwhelming experience of an infinite ocean of consciousness, divine consciousness engulfing him. And ultimately, he lost external consciousness. But then immediately afterward, he prayed to Divine Mother and said, I want to experience you in various forms and aspects. So please, oh Mother, be gracious and reveal yourself to me in different aspects and different. And I want to also experience you in the ways that people throughout the world in other countries experience you and worship you. And that was the beginning of an incredible spiritual journey in which he practiced many different Hindu spiritual paths, including not just Tantra, but different paths within Vaishnavism, where he practiced, for instance, being Radha, who is the beloved consort of Krishna. He also behaved like for some time, and the culmination of his practice as Radha was to realize Krishna, to have a direct spiritual experience of Krishna, God in the form of Krishna. For a certain period, he behaved like Hanuman. He lived like Hanuman, the great servant, disciple of Ramachandra, the Avatara. And through that practice, he became one with Hanuman's consciousness and realized God as Rama. He also realized Sita, the wife of Rama, and the list goes on. And that wasn't enough. And so he also practiced Advaita Vedanta under a naked wandering monk, sannyasi named Totapuri. And he realized the goal of Advaita Vedanta as well, which is realizing your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And it's without some background in Hinduism, it's very hard to appreciate how radically different Advaita Vedanta is from the theistic or devotional traditions of Hinduism, because Advaita Vedanta ultimately says that the personal God is a lower reality. It's only true from the empirical standpoint, but from the ultimate standpoint, the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness. And the fact that the same person can be realizing God ecstatically in so many different theistic forms, as Krishna, Kali, and then later as Christ and Allah as well. I'll get to that in a second. At the same time, realizes his true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, and then comes back from that realization and still practices bhakti, and doesn't say that, well, that Advaitic experience, that non-dual experience has now proven to me that all those personal forms of the personal God I was worshiping are ultimately false or lower realities, but that he embraced everything, all the different forms and aspects of God, impersonal, personal, with and without form, all the various forms, as all equally real and valuable. This is really, I think, almost unprecedented, I think, in the world's spiritual history. And then, as I mentioned already, but I'll say it a little bit in a little bit more detail, he also practiced Christianity and Islam for periods of time. And for instance, I'll give you an example with Christianity. He was looking intently at a picture of Mother Mary holding baby Jesus. And he became so engrossed in the picture that ultimately he saw rays of light emanating from that picture and entering his body, and all of his Hindu samskaras, which means latent mental impressions, of all, the traces left in his mind by all of his Hindu spiritual practices, because he was a Hindu, just got erased. And he was terrified, and then he was seized with this desire to practice Christianity. And so he behaved like a Christian, worshiped like a Christian, and ultimately had a direct vision of Christ, Jesus Christ, announcing that Jesus was God himself. And then Jesus merged into his own body. Um, and he also realized God as Allah through the path of Islam. So after all of these extraordinary spiritual practices and spiritual experiences, he taught one of his most famous teachings is Joto Mot Toto Pot, as many faiths, so many paths. But my favorite one of his teachings on the harmony of religions is slightly different. This is also found in the gospel, by the way, but it's in Bengali. Tini Ananto Potho Ananto, which means God is infinite, or the divine is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. And the reason why I like this teaching so much is that it explains very succinctly why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself or herself is infinite. You can't even say whether God is he or she. And that's the beauty of it. Or it. It's all everything. He, she, and it. I like to think of Sri Ramakrishna as the both and avatara. In our tradition, we worship him as an avatara, which means an incarnation, divine incarnation. But you were saying before, you know, one of your parents was Jewish, another was Catholic. And your intuition initially was to think that, well, therefore neither can be true
Right.
if they cancel each other out. But Sri Ramakrishna really is all about the both and. It's not about neither nor, it's not about either or, it's about both and. You can embrace the truth, the reality, the value of multiple spiritual ideals and paths.
Wow. And what's so powerful about hearing that, these stories, which I've heard and I'm still sitting here enthralled by them, is this when you mention, just these non-dual concepts, they are just that, concepts. They're like in your head, okay, it makes sense. Everything's one connected. I can make this, I can even scientifically argue this. However, having example of kind of a experiential version of this in a human form is just like, I think, kind of, it's hard to explain, but it takes it kind of to another level. And it like you said, it's not something that we've seen in other stories and traditions, and not to discount any of them, of course not, but to represent that non-dual idea is in an experiential way is very powerful, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
um and it's interesting because we you hear all these stories, and whatever tradition you follow, there are sticking points in spirituality. And what I like about what we've already talked about is, you've done a fair share of questioning. We see some of our ideals questioning, Swami Vivekananda being a perfect example. Um, and so I've seen a lot, and I mentioned this to you in the email, that I wanted to mention the question of suffering,
Mhm.
because it is such a sticking point, I
Mhm.
think, for a lot of people, especially widespread suffering. I mean, it's not that there's ever been a point in time in human history that there wasn't great suffering. But when we see this great suffering, as if we see, what's happening now, or people reference the Holocaust and these big, heavy things,
Mhm.
and I've heard you talk about these in a few different lectures, and it's helped me. There's some stuff that I'm still stuck on. There's some stuff that I'm like, okay, I can see, I can start understanding and see a perspective shift. I would love to just bring up kind of the question of suffering, and how do we answer to watching the unfolding of horrific events in the world. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
from
Absolutely.
these traditions.
Yeah. So Sri Ramakrishna was asked this problem, this question, this problem of evil and suffering on a number of occasions, and they're recorded in the gospel. Um, and he gave very thoughtful replies. And I, in my own work, especially in chapter 7 and 8 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, which is a book on Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, I try to explain in great detail his response to the problem of evil. So let me just briefly summarize my understanding of his views. First of all, what is the problem of evil? The problem of evil is actually a kind of a technical problem raised in the philosophy of religion and in theology. The problem is as follows. If we accept that a theistic God exists, okay, God by definition is omnipotent, which means all powerful. And God is by definition also perfectly good, perfectly loving. Now, if God were omnipotent, then he would be able to remove the sufferings from this world. And if God were perfectly good, it seems reasonable to assume that he would not want us to suffer. He would not want his creatures to suffer. So, but the fact is, we see that this world is full of evil and suffering. It's even easier to see that now than in other times in the past. Of course, there's always been suffering, as you said, but it's really acute now. And two world wars going on, or not world war, but two world wars going on at the same time. And so many other things happening. Mass shootings in the US almost daily. I mean, it's incredible.
Right.
God seeing all this, God could prevent it, but he doesn't. That's the problem of evil. So actually, sometimes the conclusion of this argument is, therefore, God doesn't exist. So often this problem of evil is posed as a challenge to the very existence of God. So it's a very, very important issue in philosophy and in theology. And it's one that any serious thinker has to grapple with. And I think any person of faith also at some point has to grapple with these issues. So how does Sri Ramakrishna grapple with this question? Somebody asks Sri Ramakrishna this question once. Why does God permit so much suffering? Why does he make us suffer so much? And Sri Ramakrishna says, he gives a very succinct answer to begin with, and then I think it requires a lot of unpacking. He says, in order to create saints, mohot lok toyer korben bole in Bengali. It's really interesting. I think it's a really new approach to answering the problem of evil. The idea is God allows us to suffer because he recognizes that suffering is necessary for us to make moral and spiritual progress. There's a lot to learn from suffering. And to fully cash out this, what's called theodicy. Theodicy is a term in philosophy coined by Leibniz, which means an explanation of why God permits all the suffering that we see in the world. So to understand Ramakrishna's theodicy, his solution to the problem of evil, we have to understand that it's grounded in a few important philosophical doctrines. Okay, the first is karma, the second is rebirth, the third is universal liberation, and the fourth and final one, and it's the kind of trickiest in a way, is what I would call mystical panentheism. Okay, these are all fancy terms, but right. So let's go through them one by one. Karma, first of all, the doctrine of karma. Most people know the doctrine in a kind of caricatured or superficial or popular way as, you have bad karma, and so that's why bad things are happening to you. There's the grain of truth in that popular understanding of karma is we reap what we sow. That's the basic principle of the doctrine of karma. At the same time, what I think that even more sophisticated understandings of the doctrine of karma within Hinduism, they often make it seem as if the doctrine is primarily retributive. Okay, karma meant as punishment or as retribution. And I did something wrong, therefore I'm going to be punished for it. God is going to punish me for it through this law of karma. But I think that there's a much healthier way of thinking about the doctrine of karma, which is more in line with what Ramakrishna taught, what Vivekananda taught, what other people in his tradition taught, like Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo. And I like to think of it as an evolutionary doctrine of karma, as opposed to a retributive law of karma. So what do I mean by an evolutionary doctrine of karma? The idea is, it's true that according to the law of karma, we reap what we sow. So if we do something unethical, we are going to reap what we sow in the form of unfortunate bad consequences. And vice versa. If we do something ethically good, for instance, or spiritually very good, we'll reap what we sow in that regard too, and we'll have good consequences. But what are good consequences? it's not just the crude formula of I do something good, therefore I will be happy in some kind of hedonistic sense. Or I do something really bad and therefore I will be unhappy in the opposite of the hedonistic sense, like go to an eternal hell and suffer torment. The idea is every experience in life is an opportunity for moral and spiritual growth, whether good or bad. And the law of karma facilitates, is meant to foster our moral and spiritual evolution and growth. That's the basic idea.
Right.
And so, yes, it's true that we reap what we sow. It's true that, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, if you eat a chili, won't your tongue burn? That's true. If we do something that we know in our heart of hearts is not the right thing to do, we're going to suffer the consequences. At the same time, the purpose of that suffering is for us to grow ethically and spiritually, and
Right.
ultimately to attain the highest goal of life. The highest purpose of life, according to Ramakrishna, is the direct experience of God in whatever form or aspect we like to think of God. Call it enlightenment, call it illumination, call it realization, whatever. But that's the goal of life. And without suffering, we could never reach that goal. Okay. And the second key doctrine here, which is linked to the doctrine of karma, is the doctrine of rebirth. What we often find is, for instance, everything I said is, in a way, some people will say, okay, fine, but what about cases of the terrible suffering of very, very young children, even babies? What could they possibly have done in this life to have deserved that? It's crazy. That's true. That's why Hindus posit rebirth, because the soul of that baby has existed for an eternity and was in a physical body prior to the current embodiment in which it's suffering terribly. And so the doctrine of karma is directly linked to the doctrine of rebirth. And so the idea is the baby is suffering because of something its soul did in a previous birth. That's the idea. Okay, so that's rebirth. So now so it's very important to keep in mind that karma and rebirth, these two doctrines are inseparable, and that our spiritual journey is a journey of many lifetimes. It's a long marathon of many physical embodiments. But the ultimate goal is to finish that marathon, which is liberation, which is enlightenment, which is realization of the divine in some form or aspect. But this brings me to the third doctrine, which is called universal liberation. Ramakrishna taught that every single soul will eventually attain liberation. There is no such thing as an eternal hell. No soul will be condemned for an eternity to hell. Every soul will eventually be liberated. Everybody will reach the end of that marathon, that spiritual marathon. And it's through the mechanisms, the machinery of karma and rebirth that we reach that goal, that each one of us will eventually reach that goal. Most of us won't reach that goal in this life. Some of us will. Most of us won't, but in a future life, we definitely will. So that should give us all hope. And that also plays a very important role. This third doctrine of universal liberation plays a very important role in coming to terms with the fact of so much evil and suffering in this world, because the idea is that no matter how terrible the suffering that we're witnessing in others, but also that we ourselves are undergoing possibly, is necessarily finite. Finite in the sense that it has a beginning and it has an end. Even if that end is the end of this physical body, because it might be that the suffering is so terrible that it results in our death. Even that's finite, because salvation, liberation, is eternal. It's an eternal state. And so the infinite good of salvation, of liberation that awaits each one of us necessarily outweighs the finite suffering that we undergo while we're in these physical bodies prior to enlightenment. Okay, and so this is these three doctrines kind of combined make up what I call Ramakrishna's saint-making response to the problem of evil. The idea is that God permits suffering, permits us to suffer in order for us to grow morally and spiritually. But that's not the end of it. There's one final kind of twist in his response to the problem of evil, and it goes as follows. There are a number of places in the gospel where when people ask him why there's so much evil and suffering in the world, Ramakrishna responds by saying, it's God's play. Leela, God's Leela. God has chosen to include evil and suffering in her world play, in her cosmic play. One astute and sort of philosophically minded visitor of Sri Ramakrishna who heard this response of Sri Ramakrishna immediately retorts, but God's play is our death. Very poignantly, he says this. And then Ramakrishna, in response, immediately, without skipping a beat, says, but who are you? It is Divine Mother alone who has become everyone and everything in this world. So this is the fourth dimension of his theodicy, his response to the problem of evil. And it's this kind of the ultimate response in a way, the ultimate, deepest metaphysical response to the problem of evil, which is the problem of evil presupposes a difference between God on the one hand and God's suffering creatures on the other. There's a difference between God and his suffering creatures, right? Ramakrishna is denying that very premise, ultimately, and says, so what do I mean by mystical panentheism? He says that there is a special kind of spiritual experience which a few rare, highly spiritually evolved souls can attain. It's called vijnana. This is kind of central to my own philosophical understanding of our tradition. He says that the vijnani realizes that God becomes everything and everyone in this world, that there's nothing but God. What does that mean? It means that the very person who thinks to himself or herself, why is God putting me through all this, is itself, the question is posed from a standpoint of ignorance. And that from the standpoint of knowledge, when you know the highest spiritual truth, you realize that God herself is playing in the form of her suffering creatures, each one of us. I'll give you an example from Ramakrishna's own life. He once saw a butterfly with a splinter in one of its wings, and so it was really struggling to fly, and possibly it died eventually. I don't know whether it died ultimately, but he looked at this butterfly and felt terrible compassion for that butterfly, and just thought to himself, what cruel boy must have put the splinter in your wing. And in the next moment, he started laughing ecstatically. And he realized then that it was Divine Mother herself playfully sporting in the form of the wounded butterfly, in the form of the boy who inflicted the pain on the butterfly, in the form of Ramakrishna witnessing this whole divine play. And then he said, whom will I feel compassion for? I mean, there's nothing but God. And God is playfully manifesting as all of these things. And so that's what I'm calling mystical panentheism. It's a mystical realization of oneness, divine oneness, that there's nothing but God in this world. And that even the suffering that we see is God playing in the form of all of these suffering creatures. Yeah. So let me stop there because I'm sure that you have questions. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think I'm glad you didn't stop, because I think the only way to even start to digest that is as a whole. Like, I can't separate,
Yeah.
none of
Right.
them work without the other
No, I
one,
think that's
because
absolutely right. That you need everything taken as a whole. Yeah.
right, because I would, it's interesting because I've heard you share this before on lectures, and as it's gone on, I'm like, I don't know about that. And then the next one, I'm like, okay. And then I'm like, well, but still, and then
Right.
okay. But and it's interesting because obviously, like you said, that last point really encompasses a lot of answers within it, in terms of, because you've kind of said that, not only suffering but compassion implies separation.
Yeah.
Because my question, when I'm hearing all this, when I hear, you know I can poke anti-compassionate holes in basic understandings of karma. Like I said, basic
Yeah.
understand until,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I
like
get it. Yeah. Yeah.
right. And because, I'm still, I hear karma, and I'm like, well, if couldn't somebody use karma in a way that says, well, that person must have done something, so I don't have to
Right.
feel the
Right.
compassion. And
Help them
then
or something. Yeah,
right,
exactly right.
right. And then, the rebirth, even with the rebirth, it can still turn down the volume on your compassion, so to speak. It could still say, well, they're this is happening now, but next time, they're growing. And I
Yeah.
do think the growth versus punishment um explanation of karma is very helpful to me, because
Yeah.
at first, when I was first kind of dealing with it, I did see it as like, well, people are, why anything that turns down our compassion, like
Hmm.
and even when I hear the
Sure.
butterfly story,
Yeah.
it's in the story makes sense and I get it, but as us who are not the
Right.
level of Ramakrishna,
Right.
um, it makes me think, all right, so because I think, all right, well, I'm getting angry. I watch the news and I get angry. Or I
Right.
I read a book on the Holocaust, I get angry. There's this quote that's it says, it's this guy named, I think I wrote it down. This guy's name is Yitz Greenberg. He's a rabbi. And he
Hmm.
said, no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
like that's so
Right.
powerful.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
but as you talk about this and help me with this, obviously, uh, I start to think, okay, so instead of like my anger and my frustration and my what can we do is also part of the thing.
That's it. I mean, I mean, I literally talked about this yesterday because I gave a talk at Loyola Marymount University on Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil.
Mm,
And I raised this objection that you just raised. And so I want to briefly explain how a follower of our tradition might answer that question because it's a very important one. The question is, well, I call it the quietism objection. The idea is, okay, I encounter somebody in profound suffering, and if I believe this karma and rebirth view, then that person had what was coming to him. And so the best thing for me to do is let him run out his bad karma. And I don't want to interfere with the workings of karma here. So let me just move on. No, stands the doctrine of karma. Okay, so let me explain why. There are two main reasons. The first is it's because of that suffering person's own good karma that another person has come along in a position to help that person. That's the first thing. Okay, first step. Second, we accrue good karma by helping others and by helping to alleviate other people's sufferings. So on both sides, the doctrine of karma understood rightly and comprehensively, actually, I think fairly effectively answers that kind of problem.
right. And when you say that, it does, to use my weird analogy, turns the volume up on the compassion, because now I understand that my part in it is to be helpful if possible. And
Yeah,
that even if I wanted to think of it of like, I need to protect my karma, even if that was my intention, it
yeah,
still would turn up the compassion. And I think that ultimately, I feel, in my perspective, I feel like any spiritual search should end in some level of connectedness and compassion.
absolutely. Yeah, I would say that. And the only other thing I would say, well, there are a couple things. So the word compassion in our tradition is interesting because um, there's a beautiful incident when Ramakrishna is describing some of the main spiritual practices of within Vaishnavism, the Vaishnava tradition of Hinduism. One of them is practicing compassion toward living beings. And he goes into the state of spiritual ecstasy. And then when he comes down from that state, he says, who are we to practice compassion? We are worms crawling on the earth. For us, there is only service. Shiva Jnane Jivir Seva, serving others in a spirit of worship by trying to see God in everyone. Because compassion implies somehow a position of superiority in some sense that I'm looking down on this person who's in pain. I'm not, and therefore I feel compassion with them. And let me help you out of this terrible situation. Who are we to help anyone? God alone can help. God alone can be compassionate toward others. We can serve. I think that's so.
Mm.
I think maybe okay. So that's one thing I would add. The second thing is you use the word anger several times, and I completely understand why that's a kind of natural response to what's going on now and the mass shootings going on in Ukraine and Gaza and Israel. But from a spiritual standpoint, any emotional reaction is unwholesome and a bondage. So anger, it depends. I mean, it could be a kind of, so I don't, it depends on whether when you say anger, is it an emotional reaction or is it something, or is it a compassionate kind of indignation or something? That
Mm.
would be okay. But emotional reactions of any sort are, it's usually the ego that sort of in some form is reacting immediately without the kind of mediation of rationality or some deeper spiritual kind of intervention or source. Yeah, but I want you to kind of clarify maybe what you meant by anger. Maybe that would.
Well, and it's funny because maybe that explanation came out as quickly as the anger that I feel when I watch it, and it might be an under explored feeling. You know what
Mm,
I'm saying? Like I'm just
yeah,
feeling some tension. Maybe I could say
right,
that. And
right.
this is what I find so interesting, and I'm glad that you
Mm,
clarified the compassion and service thing. And
yeah,
this just I had another thought that I had jotted down for this talk, and that was how important words are. And this just proves that.
yeah,
Like the choices we, especially when we're talking about these big ideas of religion and spirituality and the words we use, so the service and compassion thing really helps. But like I said, maybe when I see these news feeds, whether it's through social media or the news on TV, or hear people talking at work, and I feel what I just called anger
yeah,
might be a tension in my body, and then instead of saying I'm angry, I could say, what is this tension, where is it coming from,
right.
and explore it. So even, man, that words, man, they'll take you down a path that
Absolutely. And then
so
and then
yeah.
I think the right response to this, what you're calling tension, or maybe sympathetic indignation or something,
Mhm.
is to ask yourself, is there a way I can improve the situation, alleviate the suffering, serve? Is there a way I can serve? I mean, I have a friend who's been living in Kiev in Ukraine for over a year now, serving.
Mhm.
And he's also, by the way, initiated in our tradition. And he started a whole nonprofit company to serve.
Right.
Yeah,
And it can be overwhelming too, especially like how can we serve in the face of global issues? You know what I
right,
mean? Sometimes then, that'll hit us, and then we feel like a guilt, and maybe that guilt spawns this anger. Now I'm just going to rant on
right,
social media,
right,
because that's what I have to do in order. I see a
right.
lot of people posting a lot of opinions that they didn't say anything about 6 months ago.
Well, look, I think that there are many different ways to serve
Mhm.
and to help. And the only way to serve is not to run off to the Ukraine, as my friend has done, which is admirable. But that's not the only way, right? And I think of the very inspiring life and example of the Peace Pilgrim. Have you heard of Peace Pilgrim?
Mhm. No.
Oh, I recommend that you. It's a book called Peace Pilgrim, but it's about her life. She's this incredible American woman, born and raised in Boston, like myself.
Hmm.
And from a young age, she just had these very deep spiritual inclinations. And one day she just decided to become essentially a wandering nun. I mean, without any kind of formal affiliations, without even subscribing to any particular religion, organized religion. And she literally just walked throughout the country for years. And I mean, for her entire life, without a penny in her pocket, wearing just the clothes on her back. And obviously she met all sorts of people and she spoke to them, and she called herself the Peace Pilgrim. And this was, imagine, during the time of the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
and she called herself Peace Pilgrim. And she could have gone to the picket lines and fought against the Vietnam War. But what she did, what she thought she was doing, was something even more fundamental than that. Because what she said is, until people have inner peace, there will never be outer peace. There will always be physical violence until you can establish inner peace within. And so her movement, her efforts were directed toward cultivating inner peace in herself and in other people, both through her own example, because she was this incredible saint. So you see how that's another way of serving. You see, by and of course you can always kind of hide behind spirituality, for instance, as a kind of excuse for not making real change in the world, but that's if you're disingenuous or insincere. But if you're sincere, then every Vivekananda used to say each is great in his or her own place. I mean, that's the idea, is that we can all serve in our own way based on our particular strengths, our unique talents, abilities, where we're uniquely situated in this world, in light of particular constraints, right? And so I think it would be misleading to think that there's only one way to serve. There are many ways to serve, and we should figure out what the best way for us, for each one of us in particular, to serve is.
Right. And I love the idea that this does go internal, because as I should that should be an immediate thought for me, but it wasn't. I started thinking just of the external, not that your own internal
Mhm.
work is also going to ripple out into your daily interactions and continue to serve in these subtle ways that you might not even recognize. And I think that's very good reminder. And it actually calls back to the every situation is an opportunity for our spiritual moral growth, like you said. So
Yeah,
the to find ways to serve and to define service in a way that is more in line
capacious.
with,
Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
right. So yeah, that's a very powerful shift, I think. And it's again with the wording and how we define it, and then how we
Yeah.
look at our lives and how it
Peace.
applies to,
What is peace and what is violence? I mean, but these are
yeah,
fundamental questions.
yeah,
And for her, peace is inner fulfillment, inner peace. And so
right,
she's really, saints like her are trying to address the root cause of all the suffering we find in this world, of all the physical violence, all the bloodshed we see in the world, you see.
right,
Because sad but true, we have these two wars going on now, at least, and there are others, but there are going to be more in the future until we address the root cause. So we
right.
also need people working on the root cause. That's what I would say.
Yeah, because I mean, it that makes a lot of sense. Because I mean, if we don't fundamentally move towards
Yeah,
our own piece, then
yeah,
we're the same thing. So that if you have a broken piece in your car and you
yeah.
put some tape on it, it's still gonna
That's right.
break again. Like it's not,
Ego is
yeah,
the root of all physical violence and other forms of suffering and violence. And so until you address the root cause, which is overcoming ego, you're
right.
not going to make any substantial progress in that regard.
Now, I just thought this when you said ego, because again, conceptually, that's a big thing, and people can say ego, but is how often would you say like the ego is scared in a way? Like the reactive ego is fearful in a way. Like so I when I heard you say that, I thought a lot of times I think when I'm reactive, I'm in some way scared. Scared of I'm gonna lose this, or something's not gonna go my way, or I'm gonna lose
Yeah,
control.
yeah.
And so I feel like there's some connection between ego and fear.
Mm.
Um I don't know why that popped in my head, but that just jumped in as you said that.
Yeah, I mean, some people don't even like the term ego, and so another word that we can use as a synonym, as a rough synonym, would be selfishness.
Hmm,
It's really selfishness that's the root cause of suffering
right,
inflicted on other people. I mean, I really think so.
right.
And so the more selfless we become by addressing that root cause, which is this kind of spiritual poverty, the
Mhm.
closer we come to arriving at world peace, it seems to me.
Right, and if I'm feeling a selfish impulse,
Mhm.
asking myself kind of, what am I worried about? Like, if I think, "Oh, I gotta," like, what is it that is
Yeah.
creating that impulse, and it might
Well,
be,
fear and anxiety come from ego in the sense that as long as I feel that I'm one being
mm,
over against everyone else in the world, and that this whole world becomes a competition.
right,
And then I'm constantly in fear of, well, what if that person takes the happiness that I'm looking for, that I want for myself?
right,
What if that person gets that coveted dream job that I've been coveting? What
right,
if it's all about me and mine, about me?
right,
That's where fear and anxiety is really rooted
right.
in.
As if peace is finite and we all need to, like, save our bank account to have the
That's
most
right.
peace,
That's
you
right.
know?
Maximize for ourselves at the expense of others, right?
Right, yeah, because I think that's in a lot of cultures, that's the way we understand the world, some people have more, some people have less. So we obviously would then extrapolate that to feelings and, inner states. Like, well, I got to get as much peace as I can. So
Absolutely.
that means someone else doesn't get it. And
It's
that's
zero
very
sum kind of a thing or a trade-off. Yeah, exactly.
right.
That's the
Uh,
ego thinking. Yeah.
right. That's, that what's interesting about the problem of evil or this question of suffering is it can be applied to almost all, like those things that you said are applicable in lesser, because even the word evil is a pretty heavy word, and you go, well, I'm
Yeah.
not evil. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's see, is this a selfish thing?
Right.
And now also to just play slight devil's advocate or just clarify for somebody, because I think there are people who might say, well, that means I have to always be putting myself out for others, and to a point where now let's say I'm giving my every ounce of emotional energy to other people, and I have no way of, now I'm anxious all the time, and
Mhm.
kind of a people pleaser sort of situation. um so someone might think, all right, well, I need to be selfless, and then they'll consistently do that and then kind of deplete themselves.
Yeah. It's all about balance, I think.
Hmm.
The other thing is, if by quote unquote serving others, you end up spiritually depleting yourself, then you're not serving them properly, it seems to me.
Right.
And you would be doing them a better service if you were more spiritually anchored in a
Right.
certain, it doesn't have to be the ultimate inner peace, but at least a certain kind of
Right.
basic, because who are we to serve others when we ourselves are a mess?
Right. Right.
And so balance, I think, is really important. And you're
Right.
right that one of the dangers in making service our motto is neglecting our own kind of what gives us fulfillment and what gives us peace. But that's why I think striking a balance is really important.
Yeah, I agree, and that makes a lot of sense. To kind of understand that concern is,
Mhm.
you have to have something to give, so you need to
Right,
replenish yourself in
right.
order to even have extra to give.
Give.
If we want to call it extra. Now I'm hung up on every word. Every word. I'm like,
Right,
we
right.
got to define every single word
Sure.
before we keep going. Um,
Like a good
well, I
philosopher.
I
Yeah.
really I do appreciate you going through that, because I know you have a lot, even just this week already, it sounds like, at Loyola. So I
Yeah.
appreciate us talking about
No, I'm
that,
happy
because
to talk about it. Yeah.
I think it is something that, is important to really anybody, but spiritual seekers in particular. I think
Absolutely. And I wanted to
sometimes
add one thing. I didn't actually
Mhm,
mention one other component to Ramakrishna's
mhm,
response to the problem of suffering, which is significant. It's mystery. Um,
mm,
it's what's technically called in philosophy of religion skeptical theism. And this is the view that basically we, with our finite, puny human intellects, who are we to judge God? Who are we to think that, looking at a particular kind of instance of suffering, to decide that God should not have permitted this suffering? How could we possibly know that with our finite minds?
right,
How could we possibly know why God does the things that God does?
right,
And the way that one philosopher, William Alston, puts it, and I like this analogy that he uses, he says, imagine that the world's greatest chess player is playing chess. Magnus Carlsen, let's say, the current greatest, um, playing with another, great champion or whatever. And I am watching this match. And I know the rules of chess, but I'm terrible at it. And that's true of me, which is I know the rules of chess, but I'm really bad at it. Okay. So imagine I'm watching Magnus Carlsen play, and I'm more or less following the first couple of moves and I'm admiring them. And then suddenly he makes this move, which completely baffles me. Now, there are two ways I could respond to that, react. One is, what the hell does he think he's doing? That's one response. I wouldn't have made that move, right? That's one response. The second response is, wow, that is a move I would not have made. But because he is so much better at chess than I am, almost infinitely better than I am, he must know what he's doing and doing it for a reason which I can't fathom.
mm,
That's beyond my comprehension. And so William Alston, this philosopher, says the latter response is obviously the more sensible one to take in the context of this chess match with Magnus Carlsen.
Right.
Likewise, when we are confronted with suffering and we're believers, I mean, we're people of faith who believe in God, the right response is not to put God on trial and to say that there's no possible reason why God would allow this to happen, but to just throw up our hands in mystery, kind of like Job in
Mm.
the Hebrew Bible, right? In the book of Job. And to say, I cannot fathom God's ways. How can I ever know why God does what God does? And, in Hinduism, God not only creates and preserves, but also destroys.
Mm.
Creator, preserver, and destroyer. And then Sri Ramakrishna asks, can can we always know why God destroys? Can we ever know why God destroys? At some point
Right.
also we have to appeal to mystery.
Right.
But that itself has a kind of philosophical and rational basis, as I want to say, right?
Right. No, and I follow that, and I'm gonna throw this question out to you though. Is there value? So let's to use that analogy and to talk about, the Ramakrishna and the idea that God realization is the ultimate goal. And if Magnus Carlsen's making a move that we don't understand, if our in that analogy, our goal would be to be as good as Magnus or like to be a great chess player, would I then, is it my duty to then question him and say, hey, why did you do that? I know that it's a little of a weird kind of analogy, but would it be my responsibility then to question?
Uh, right. So the thing is, there's nobody who's equivalent to God, right? I mean, there's
Hmm.
God alone is equivalent to God. And so there's no
Hmm.
question of becoming Magnus Carlsen. I mean, that's where the analogy breaks down in a way, right? I
Right.
mean, Magnus Carlsen is God in this analogy, right?
Right. Right.
And we are God's creatures with finite minds, and therefore we should humbly acknowledge the fact that we can never understand the omniscient, omnipotent mind of God.
Right.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's yeah, it kind of like I'm in some sense, it's not like I have access to Magnus Carlsen. So in my version,
Right.
I was saying that I could just walk up, tap him on the shoulder, and be like, "Teach me this." But in the
Right. So look, I mean, in the right. So on the spiritual side of this analogy, I think the equivalent would be what Sri Ramakrishna calls the spiritual experience of Vijnana,
Mhm.
where the only real solution is to become Magnus Carlsen, which is to
Yeah,
become God, and to realize that there's nothing but God playfully sporting as Magnus Carlsen and as his weaker opponent and as the person in the audience watching the game.
right.
Do you see what I mean?
Right.
Uh,
And I mean, in my head, I'm literally working through this as we talk, but that would mean that all of the things we do in terms of our intention of service and our spiritual practices are us kind of asking just little by little. It's a smaller, us trying to get closer and closer to understanding this grand concept. So it's in my version of the analogy, it was, one question, you get an answer, but in this version and when you flip it to the God part of the analogy, it's a much, it's beyond a comprehension of like how, it feels slow in my, in a human form. One life feels like, okay, well, I need all the answers. Well, I'm not going to get all of the answers, and that's where you said you throw up to the mystery.
that's right. Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
right.
Yeah, 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 I follow that. I love analogies. I like picking them apart and looking at like, what
Sure,
if
yeah.
this and what if that? So I really appreciate you playing along and
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
and letting me do that. So I have, uh, and this is just out of curiosity. It's not as big of a question in terms of that, but it kind of plays along with the service thing because there's a local Swami at the temple I go to, and he mentioned something about how anything you put after I am is very significant. I am a, a doctor. I am this, and these come with roles and all these expectations and stuff. And his suggestion was just I am a devotee. Just be
Right.
devoted. And I absolutely loved that. And I wanted to throw that to you and just see how you interpret that and like what that actually means. Like, to be a devotee, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah. So Sri Ramakrishna, he used to say that he used to say, how can you completely eliminate ego? He says, so instead of trying to eliminate it, try to transform it. And instead of identifying with what he calls the rascal I, the rascal ego, which is that I, that ego, which is attached to worldly things, identify with the I of the devotee, the I that says, I am a child of God, I am a spark of that divine fire, I'm a servant of God. So that's the basic idea, is that you can, it's a kind of, through spiritual practice, you're actually trying to change your identity. And realize that you're actually a child of God and not this ego which is attached to worldly things, but something, a deeper spiritual entity, a
Right.
soul, a deeper soul, which is intimately united with the divine.
Right. And I think the reason that stuck out to me, and one of the original concepts in my mind that got me considering what I am, what to put after I am, because I knew I am Sean and I am from Missouri and I am working here and I'm a brother and a son and all the stuff. And I thought, I considered, the moment I was born, before I had been told all the things, before they gave me the list, the printout of who I am, I was something. I was already something. Like there was something there, whether that's consciousness or how soul or whatever. Like there was
Mhm.
something beyond all of the words that I would typically use to describe who I am, to make me recognize that, okay, those things are my experiences, but not who I am. Therefore, if that element of me still exists, can I get in touch with it? Can I go beyond all the things that I put after I am? But when he said I am a devotee, I was like, that one feels comfortable. Like that one feels useful.
Absolutely. It's very, very effective to,
Mm-hmm.
it's easier said than done is another part of this, is that it's always easier to talk about spirituality than to actually practice and live it.
Right.
That's why when people call themselves spiritual, I kind of it raises my hackles, because I mean, if you're really spiritual, it means you've already identified with the deeper Atman, with the deeper self,
Right.
with the spiritual self within, and that's an enormous achievement. I mean, I like to think that I don't call myself spiritual. I like to call myself a kind of somebody who's aspiring to be spiritual.
Right. Right.
Um, yeah, spirituality is the goal.
Mm.
Yeah. And we're spiritual aspirants. That's certainly true.
Right. I'm spiritually curious, I would
Yeah,
say. but
yeah, sure. Yeah.
but yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. So another thing I wanted to throw out, um, what time we got? We got a little bit more time. Um, Personally, I would just like to see if you have any favorite Holy Mother stories, anything that really like it could be for any reason at all. I don't feel like I would be happy with myself if we went through this whole conversation. I didn't hear a little bit of a Holy Mother story or something
Hmm.
important or something that feels like you'd like to share. Whatever pops in your brain, I'm happy to listen to.
Sure. Well, a lot of things pop into my brain, but I'll just choose one. And there's an incident when Sri Ramakrishna is grooming his future monastic disciples, this young man, the future Vivekananda, the future Niranjanananda. And this is a story involving Niranjanananda. His name was Niranjan, and he was fond of eating, and he had a big body and muscular. So he would eat a lot. And he was eating a lot of chapatis at night in front of Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna scolded him. And well, scolded Holy Mother and said, why are you feeding him so many chapatis? He shouldn't be eating so much at night. It's not good for his brahmacharya, for his spiritual life. And then Holy Mother, she was obviously extremely humble and deferent to Sri Ramakrishna, but this activated the mother in her. And she snapped back and she said, you know, uh, you do whatever you want with them apart from food, but I'm going to look after I'm their mother. And so don't interfere with me when it comes to what a mother does, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that just shows that the dual nature of every mother, really, every good mother, who on the one hand is very soft and tender and loving,
Mm.
but on the other hand can be fierce when necessary,
Right.
uh, and incredibly powerful and fearless. And Swami Vivekananda says once, he says, imagine a mother walking down the street and maybe a street dog starts barking at this mother. What will the mother do? She might shrink back in fear or something like that. Says, but imagine that same mother if she's walking with her child and a tiger comes about to assault her baby. Who will be standing in front of between the tiger and the baby? It'll be the mother. She'll become
Right.
completely fearless, and
Right. Yeah,
uh,
that's a perfect story. I love that. That's I haven't heard that either. So that's
yeah.
extra special. I'm glad that you shared that. Um, and I want to touch because I had this thought the other day. I was like, I really feel like, there I'm only a couple years into learning about this tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition and Vedanta and stuff. So I'm a baby. I know I know almost nothing. But I thought about this the other day and I thought, yeah, between Holy Mother, Ramakrishna, and Vivekananda, I was like, I feel like I'm taking like a multivitamin. Like there's different aspects
Yeah.
of nutrients and all of
Yeah.
these different stories,
Absolutely.
and they kind of all are together. And one of the things that I heard you talk about, and that resonates with me, and we'll just touch on this for a second because we haven't mentioned Vivekananda except for in passing, um, is this idea of his ideas of strength. And I've kind of drawn to these ideas of how our physical self and our physical
Mhm.
um activities can be spiritualized. And you
Mhm.
do have a whole great lecture on this, so I'm just recommending anyone who thinks that's a cool concept, go watch this on YouTube. But I would love for just to hear maybe a shred of what's maybe a tip that we could, for those who want to be active, and we're all kind of active in some way, how can we spiritualize these physical activities?
Sure. Yeah. It's all about your inner attitude and your
Mm,
motivation, I think, and about purifying your motive and changing your inner attitude and making it more spiritual. It's not the activity that's inherently spiritual or unspiritual. It's about how you do it.
mm,
That's true of something that seems to be, let's say, like inherently spiritual, like let's say worshiping God. But if you're worshiping God with the intention of impressing other people and getting at promotion or something, then
right,
that's not spiritual. And if you're doing physical exercise but with a spiritual attitude, that's a much deeper spiritual practice than worshiping God with a selfish attitude, uh,
right,
or giving in charity with the inner motivation of getting a giant plaque on the wall with your name on it, saying that you've donated so and so such and such amount of money. Yeah, so that's one thing, is just the attitude should be, I am trying to keep my body healthy so that I can serve the divine, because this body is a temple of God, is a temple of the divine. The divine resides within each one of us in our hearts.
right,
And unless we're healthy, we won't be able to engage in spiritual practice. We won't be able to realize the goal of life, and we won't be able to serve others.
right,
And we become a liability actually to society, to our family, by becoming ill, right? If we don't keep our
mm,
bodies healthy. So that's
right,
one aspect of it. And there is a whole lecture on this where I talk about many other facets. But a simple way to spiritualize physical activity is to mentally repeat a mantra. If you've been given a mantra, even if you haven't been given a mantra by a guru, you can just repeat a mantra that appeals to you, Om or something else. And you can synchronize that mantra with either your breath or your stroke if it's swimming, depending on the nature of the physical activity. And first of all, what I've seen from my own experience is that it improves the physical exercise because it actually helps you kind of not be so deeply identified with the body.
mm,
And because it's you kind of have this, you've synchronized your stride, or what, if you're running, it's with your stride and with your breath. There's a kind of rhythm to the activity which actually improves the physical activity, I think. And at the same time, you're making it spiritual. You're
right,
spiritualizing that activity, and you're doing it as an offering to God.
right. Yeah, I love that. And I like the idea of shifting in order to be of service, to be available for service, because and it's a slow shift. It's a slow
Yeah,
shift because when I exercise, I'm just starting to get to a point where I'm like, you know what, I'm doing this so I can help my mom if she needs help with something, or I can help at the temple when they need someone to carry a table upstairs. I can
right.
be that guy, you know.
Right.
But
And
yeah,
I mean, look, and it doesn't even have to be that. I mean, that might come off as artificial, but another thing you can do, simple thing is right before you engage in physical activity, say you can repeat a mantra. That's why we do that before we eat. We do it, but you can just mentally offer what you're about to do to the divine.
mm,
And then, as I said, if you can try to repeat the mantra during the activity, great. And at the end, you should also offer that activity to the divine again. And so, if at the beginning and the end you think of God and you remind yourself that you're doing this as a service, the activity itself is a service to God. It's not just through the activity I'll remain healthy and therefore be better able to serve others,
right,
but everything you do. I mean, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, Krishna says, Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasi yattapasikanti yattatkurusha madarpanam, which means whatever you do it as an offering to me. Whatever you do without exception. In fact, this reminds me of Girish Ghosh, the great playwright, Bengali playwright. Um, he came to Sri Ramakrishna and he was an alcoholic and he had many other vices, but one of his vices was alcoholism. And he came to Sri Ramakrishna helplessly. And and Girish says, I can't give it up, no matter how much I try. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, okay, then what you should do is next time you're about to drink, offer that bottle to Divine Mother first.
mm,
And he did. And lo and behold, after some time, he couldn't drink anymore.
mhm.
So you can literally offer everything to God, but ultimately you'll find that those things that are sort of in your heart of hearts aren't right, that are wrong, you're not going to offer those to the divine uh,
Right,
for very long. Yeah.
right, yeah, that's great, and I mean the power behind kind of an intention, and setting that intention and kind of the reminder of it. I mean, especially with how we work nowadays, where it's like I go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. I get my workout in, then I do this, and then I do this. To
Right.
even have those pauses in to recognize some intention or offering, you know, even it feels like a very practical
It
and
makes an enormous difference. That's why mindfulness is so important and popular now, is because that's what mindfulness does. It just like makes you a little bit more mindful of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
right. Yeah, no, I'm all for that. I'm like even picturing, because intention going into a workout or a lift, especially or whatever, I've never thought about when I leave, when I'm done, and and putting pauses there. I think that's, and how many things in the day that I just go through, just go do it, do it, do
Exactly.
it, do it,
Almost
you know,
mechanically or just without
right.
thinking so much
Just
about it.
habitually, like you just turn,
Unconsciously, you could say, yeah, exactly.
right, right, just all day long, just a full,
Yeah.
18 hour or 16 hours of doing
Yeah.
whatever. So that's very practical, I think, and useful. Um, so we're approaching the end of our time, I think, but I always ask the same questions at the end to everybody. So just because you made me nervous at the beginning doesn't mean you get off the hook for these questions. But one of which is, I started this podcast in order to just to share things that were either important or interesting to me, concepts. Sometimes it's just bands that have songs that I, like anything, right? So it's to share. Um, so I always ask the guest if they have any suggestions, whether it's a book, practice, anything at all that they would say, you know what, people just try this. I always give that opportunity for the guests. Do you have any suggestions that you'd say, hey, maybe try this to the listeners?
Uh, yeah, it's hard to say any one thing, but if you uh talking about books, I strongly recommend the book Peace Pilgrim. I think that
Mm,
not enough people are aware of it. And I think more people should be aware of it. It's an incredible book, very
right.
inspiring life and teachings of Peace Pilgrim, this wonderful lady. And I think it's full of practical advice, actually. So that's one thing I would recommend in terms of a book. And in terms of what you can do, um, this might not be a popular thing to say, but
Mm,
I think that it's real. I think a really important component in spiritual life is just learning not to take yourself so seriously.
mm,
I think that's really important. I think it's at the root of a lot of mental health issues, actually, just taking yourself too damn seriously and,
Right.
and thinking that the world revolves around you. And I think that in spiritual life, especially, there's a kind of spiritual form of that kind of egoism where everything becomes every moment, every waking moment, every day is a struggle with your lower impulses and this and that. It's true, it from one standpoint, but you can easily become kind of sort of too obsessed with and too serious about everything in spiritual life. And then you beat yourself up when you fail, when you make a mistake, and it becomes this vicious cycle where you can't get out. And spiritual life becomes a kind of chore, like getting your teeth pulled out. And so always try to keep the joy in spiritual life. And one of the ways you can do it is a very practical way. And now you're going to say I'm biased, but I really think that reading a little bit of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna every day is an incredible antidote to taking yourself too seriously. Because one of the most common refrains in that book is everyone laughs,
Mhm.
full of laughter.
I have to say this is maybe I'm biased too because this is probably my favorite suggestion that I've gotten. One I love about how you put that is I read it for the first time in its entirety this year.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, man, I don't know if I retained that much. I don't know what I got from it. And I thought, you know what I think? They're laughing and singing the whole time.
Oh yeah, that's it.
Just laughing and
The
singing the
part of
whole
joy.
time.
He's cracking jokes. They're just, I mean, that's spirituality, you know?
Yeah, I love that. I'm so glad you
Let's not
pointed that
lose
out.
sight of that. Let's not make it seem as if spiritual life is all about, sort of depriving yourself of joy.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Just being stoic 100% of the
yeah,
time. Like, okay,
yeah.
like
But it's a
this is
rookie mistake that I've seen a lot in a lot of spiritual aspirants and even
right.
monks. And I think that's no way to live.
Right. Especially because, I mean, I know we talked about all the horrors and all the scary stuff that goes on, but this is also really weird and silly being a human. Like, there's
Yeah,
so much just
yeah,
absurdity
yeah.
in it that's like, can
Yeah.
we just like point that out for a
That's
second?
why
That,
I said in one I was in England a few weeks ago and I don't know what the context was, I don't remember, but I brought up Seinfeld, which I said was my favorite TV show, and I stand by it. It's because partly what Seinfeld does, even though it's not an overtly spiritual show, it points up the absurdity of life,
Mhm.
which is itself a very spiritual recognition, a spiritual
Right.
insight, seems to me.
I
Yeah,
mean, talk about the giving up to the mystery, giving up and laughing at the mystery
yeah,
sometimes. Like, and even with the butterfly story that you mentioned, it the
absolutely.
laughter came like when
Yeah,
this. I feel like laughter comes when there's some recognition of truth. That's
yeah,
why, like, when you go to a comedian and you laugh, it's because they told something that resonates with you as truth.
right.
So there's a lot of that, I think, in our day-to-day experiences. And yeah, I think just laughing with people, I think that's great. So even if you're not a follower of Ramakrishna, laugh with people is
Absolutely.
such a good one. I love that so much. I'm glad you brought that up. Um, okay, so my last question, and this is going to be kind of interesting because it's based off the story of Peter Pan.
Mm.
So Peter Pan has, there's the Lost Boys in Neverland, and they get some pixie dust sprinkled on them, and they think of a happy thought, and that elevates them. And I know we already talked about happy being, that word, but
Mm.
put that aside, and can you think of what is a thought or something that just elevates you, makes you feel lighter, so to speak?
Mm. The fact that we're all going to reach the finish line, I think, is that should give us all hope, joy, and solace, actually, in the end. Because I think a lot of there are religions which don't teach that, which teach that there's an eternal hell and that some of us are doomed, and it's just kind of terrifying. And Calvin says that some of us are predestined for hell, others are predestined for heaven, and which category do we fall into? And then that could become like a permanent source
Right,
of anxiety. So just to know that in the end everything will come out right,
right.
and then to
Yeah,
live life accordingly with knowing that ultimately there's good news at the end and that we
right.
can incorporate that good news now in our day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think that's major. That's a major for me. Like all of the sticking points that I have start to diminish when you think about like just universal salvation, so to speak. Like everybody.
Absolutely. I mean,
Like that's
Absolutely. Swami Vivekananda, when he came to the US, he was speaking to Christian audiences, primarily Christian audiences. And he knew that Christians drill into everybody's heads this doctrine of original sin, that we're sinners, we're sinners. And he says it is a standing libel upon human nature to call a human being a sinner. We are veritable gods on earth. We are divine. We're innately divine. That idea of our innate divinity, it's part and parcel of this doctrine of universal liberty. How can we not be liberated in the end if we are divine, right? But more fundamentally, we are divine. We're not sinners. We're not ignorant, poor creatures. Each one of us is divine. And the, all the effort and struggle in spiritual life is to realize our innate divinity.
Wow. And that's, I mean, yeah, that's so powerful. And and it goes back to this talking about words, how important words are,
Absolutely.
sin and, evil.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's some fundamental ideas, which you've explained very well. And like I'll mention this in the intro when I do this. I do a separate one. There's tons of lectures. You have a lot of lectures with a lot of really relatable stuff. I don't think you even have to um, be as involved in the Vedanta or Ramakrishna tradition to find value in these. So I appreciate you being here and sharing all this and letting me question stuff and be confused and curious. I appreciate that a lot. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything else you want to throw out there, or how you
No, I
feeling?
just want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. I've done quite a few podcasts, but you're both a good listener and a thoughtful interlocutor. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and thank you again. And I will talk to you later.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you are always everything. Bye.